Hi all! You all made it to the second week of the semester, and this week we will cover Chapter 5, Learning. Although you might think learning in the context of education, learning in psychology is much broader, attempting to explain our whole behavior. In the part 1 of the learning chapter, we will discuss how learning is defined in psychology, and go over what's called a classical conditioning. We will go over multiple examples of classical conditioning, the basic principles, and a special case of classical conditioning of developing aversive responses to certain stimulus. So, first, what is learning? Like I said in the beginning, how learning is used in psychology is a bit different than how we use it in our daily lives. So learning in psychology is any relatively permanent change in behavior. According to this definition, if we learn something, then that information will likely to influence our behavior for a long time. So if you learn about this chapter but forget about the content the next day, technically, using this definition, you did not learn the material. And that is probably more related to our memory, which we will discuss in the next chapter. So, the research on learning has a long history, and we will go back to the 1890s when an escalator, a radio, and even a paperclip was invented. A little fun fact. And in association to the field of psychology, Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist who is well known on research of digestion in dogs, winning Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1904, also coincidentally or by chance discovered classical conditioning. And I bet there is a lot of psychology majors who knows Ivan Pavlov in association with classical conditioning, but may not know that he won the Nobel Prize, which personally seemed to be a bigger deal. But anyhow, Pavlov again discovered what's known as classical conditioning, which is a type of learning that makes a reflex response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces the reflex. Okay, so that might not make sense at this moment, but here's an example. So as I mentioned, Pavlov was studying digestion of dogs, so he had multiple dogs in his laboratory. Understandably, the dogs were salivating as the dogs were presented with dog foods. Here it is. However, as the assistant was bringing dog foods, the dogs were already salivating as the assistant entered the door. So here's the assistant entering the door. And this is an example of classical conditioning. So breaking down the terminology in the definition, the reflex response here was salivation. And this can be caused by the original natural stimulus, which is the presence of food. But there is nothing special of salivation after the presence of food. There was no learning required for this. However, the dog had to learn to salivate by hearing the sound of door opening, because the dog learned that it was time for food. So this is what classical conditioning is about. So in classical conditioning, there are 4 important terminologies we need to cover to fully understand this concept. So first, the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS. So this is a stimulus that produces a response without prior learning, and unconditioned basically means unlearned or naturally occurring. In this example, the unconditioned stimulus was the food, because the dog did not have to learn to salivate when presented with food. It was naturally occurring. Next is unconditioned response, which is an unlearned reaction that is automatically elicited by the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS. Because UCS was the food, what was the dog's response after presented with food? Salivation. And we will go over the condition or learn stimulus and response. Conditioned stimulus is a previously neutral stimulus, NS, that eventually elicits a CR after being paired with the UCS. In other words, CS did not elicit any response in the beginning, but after being presented with the unconditioned stimulus, the dog eventually learned that there will be a food. So in this case, the CS is the sound of the door opening, and because when the door opens, the assistant feeds the dog eventually learned that when the dog hears the sound of the door opening, there will be a food. And what was the dog's response to conditioned stimulus? Salivation. And this is the conditioned response as it was learned response to a CS, which again was the sound of the door opening. So if you are starting to understand these concepts but need more example, don't worry. I will be going over multiple examples. So here's a similar example. First, we will start with what is going on before conditioning. So before the learning occurs. Again, the food is the US or unconditioned stimulus, and the response to the food is salivation, which is the UR or unconditioned response. But the sound of the bell is the neutral stimulus at this point because the dog is not going to salivate. Basically, the dog does not know what that bell means. And now comes the conditioning, when the learning occurs. During conditioning, we will pair the sound of the bell and the food. Basically, we will ring the bell before giving the food to the dog. Obviously, because the dog is being presented with the food, the dog is going to salivate. However, after the conditioning is complete, just by hearing the sound of the bell will make the dog salivate. Now, the sound of the bell has turned into CS or conditioned stimulus because it elicited salivation. Notice that the UR and the CR will be the same. However, the importance is what elicited those responses. If the dog salivated due to the food, then that salivation is the UR. But if the dog salivated due to the sound of the bell, then that salivation is the CR. So here's another example. When getting bitten by a dog, that would elicit fear or pain. We do not need to learn that. So the dog biting the leg is the UCS, and the fear or the pain that follows is the UCR. But by after getting bitten by a dog, an individual may develop dog phobia, for example, and just by looking at any dog may elicit the same response of fear or pain. And if this occurs, then the presence of any dog becomes a CS, and the fear or the pain response that follows will become the CR. So classical conditioning is everywhere. Are there anyone who would be anxious when seeing a person in a white lab coat, for example, in a hospital? If so, you probably were classically conditioned. When you were little, you probably had multiple shots, and the shots giving you may have worn a white lab coat. Obviously, for the first time you saw a person with a white lab coat, that did not elicit any responses. But because after getting shots from people wearing a white lab coat, you may have been classically conditioned that the white lab coat changes from a neutral stimulus to conditioned stimulus, which would elicit fear responses. Another example is related to advertisements. So have you ever seen a Coca-Cola commercial in a Christmas version? If not, I will post a link in the description so you could watch this 1-minute video clip. You might not think of classical conditioning here, but if you are a heavy Coca-Cola drinker, then you may potentially have been classically conditioned. So let's break it down. Before conditioning, we all know that Christmas is an exciting time of the year, and you might have gotten presents every year, and hearing the Christmas songs make you just feel happy and think about the closeness you experience with your family. So no learning here. And before conditioning, Coca-Cola was a neutral stimulus. It was just one type of soda among the many, so probably close to no response. However, what Coca-Cola was smart was they thought about pairing Coca-Cola with Christmas. And obviously, we would see the commercial multiple times. And as we see these commercial, the Christmas version of Coca-Cola commercial, we unconsciously, well, all classical conditioning actually occurs unconsciously, but we unconsciously tie Coca-Cola with the excitement of Christmas. And what ends up happening is that the Coca-Cola, which was originally a neutral stimulus, changes to a conditioned stimulus, which would elicit the same response as we imagine Christmas. So very clever business strategy. So hopefully, as we've gone through several examples, you understood the fourth concept of classical conditioning. And classical conditioning can happen fairly easily, but there are a few basic principles. CS, or at first neutral stimulus or NS, must come before UCS. So the sound of the bell must come before the food, and it cannot go the other way, where the dog is giving a food and then ringing a bell. That would not work. CS and UCS must be presented very close together in time. So when making the sound of the bell, the food would need to be given right after. It will not be successful if the food is given an hour later ringing the bell. I mean, dog is probably going to forget about it. Neutral stimulus or NS must be reliably paired with the UCS, meaning that when making the sound of the bell, this must be constantly paired with the food. It will not work if the food is presented now and then after ringing the bell. It has to be consistent. In our example of classical conditioning, we talked about pairing the sound of the bell and the food, so that the dog will salivate just by hearing the bell. Let's say that the researcher used this bell during the classical conditioning. However, there are obviously many types of bell out there, such as this one and this one. If the dog began to salivate with these two different bells, then we would say that the stimulus generalization occurred, which is a tendency to respond, in this case a dog, to a stimulus that is similar to the original CS with the CR. So basically among these bells, no matter which one we use, they are all considered to be CS, resulting in CR. So basically salivating regardless of which bell you use. However, stimulus generalization may not occur all the time. For example, let's say that we use this bell, which probably would sound very different from the original CS. In this case, the dog would probably not salivate. This is an example of stimulus discrimination, which is a tendency to respond with CR to the original CS, but not with a stimulus that is similar to the original CS. Another thing to think about cross conditioning is how could we stop the dog to salivate when hearing the sound of the bell? So basically undoing the classical conditioning. Any ideas? So the way to undo classical conditioning is to stop presenting the UCS, or unconditioned stimulus, which in this case was the food. So you ring the bell, but you don't give the food. This is an example of extinction, which is the weakening of the CR when the UCS is present. So this is what we have talked so far. Pretty amazing that we could show everything we learned in the last 15-ish minutes in a single slide. The x-axis is the time and the y-axis is the amount of salivation as a result of CS, which in this case is the bell. The first phase of class conditioning was the learning phase, where the dog is being presented with both the sound of the bell and the food. After repeating this multiple times, the amount of salivation due to the bell will continue to increase. But what will happen when the food is no longer presented after ringing the bell? The dog would still salivate, but the amount would significantly decrease pretty quickly and may stop salivating. And let's say that you had the dog take a break from all these classical conditioning. We all got tired. Just take a break. And probably the dog had enough. So the dog had a break and was not presented with the bell. And then after a while, the researcher decided to ring the bell. What do you think will happen? In other words, do you think the dog will salivate? If you are thinking logically, I agree with you that because the dog stopped salivating as the extinction progressed, the dog would not salivate when the researcher rings the bell after a resting period. However, what the research suggests is that the dog would in fact begin to salivate again when hearing the sound of the bell. This is called spontaneous recovery, which is reappearance of a learned response after extinction has occurred. And this also implies that learning, again, we talked about this in the first slide, is a relatively permanent change in behavior. So now we focus on how the classical conditioning can be applied to humans. John B. Watson conducted an experiment using a baby, or called Little Albert, and he basically attempted to classical condition the baby so that the baby would elicit fear to objects that the baby was not fearful at the beginning. And I mean, how ethical is that? What was the IRB doing at that time? Well, there wasn't one at that time. So as we go over many classical psychology experiments throughout this semester, there are actually many experiments that are very difficult to conduct today because of ethical reasons. And I will post the link on John B. Watson's experiment in the description. So you could pause this lecture and first watch this experiment. And I think it will be really interesting. Alright, assuming that all of you watched the video, there is also a special case of classical conditioning. One example is the conditioned taste aversion, which is the development of a nausea or aversive response to a particular taste because that taste was followed by a nausea reaction. So this is a classical conditioning. So even if the food itself did not cause aversive responses, when an individual experiences aversive responses for some other reasons, we are likely to be classically conditioned, and just by looking at the food would create aversive responses. And this is a special case of classical conditioning because the classical conditioning occurs after only one pairing or association. So if you ate something followed by a nausea reaction, you do not need to repeat this multiple times, as in the case in ringing the bell and presenting the food. So why do you think only one pairing is enough? One of the reasons may be that this becomes essential to our survival. If we need to be paired many times, that means that we will be experiencing nausea reactions every time, and that will certainly decrease the likelihood of our survival. So there appears to be some biological preparedness, which is a tendency to learn certain associations with only one or few pairings due to the survival value of the learning. This is also related in what we develop phobias to. You probably heard of snake or spider phobia, but it is very less likely to develop a dog phobia. So, this is all I have for the part 1 of chapter 5 on learning. And hopefully you understood the concept of classical conditioning. And again, if you have any questions, post it on the Q&A on the discussion board. Otherwise, I will see you at part 2 of chapter 5 on learning. Thanks and take care.